So what we're up to is that we have the first book of the Torah covers almost 2,000 years. And then the second book of the Torah, things slow down quite a bit. The Jews are in Egypt, but most of the Torah begins from when the Jews are liberated. And the Jews are liberated, and from the time the Jews are liberated, they take 7 weeks to go to Sinai. Then after receiving the Torah, 40 days later, they make the tragic mistake of, I'm going to mute all, by the way, just for background noise. If you want to say something, please unmute yourself to hear you, your questions, your comments, but right now everyone's on mute. And so because of that, there was a tragic mistake of making the golden calf, and Moses comes down the mountain, he breaks the tablets. Is that tragedy which we've gone through, we've explored, and will keep coming up. And then the Jews beg for forgiveness. Moses goes up the mountain for 40 days, another 2 times. So in other words, it's 3 times altogether, and finally comes down the mountain with the second tablets, really representing the Jews' rehabilitation, that they're back in the saddle, that God is allowing them to retake their place as people of the Torah. And that is on Yom Kippur. So if you think about it, they leave Pesach, they leave Egypt Pesach, so spring. 7 weeks later, which is like today would be June time, that's Shavuos, that's when they get the Torah. In the fall, the 10th day of Tishrei, that is when Moses comes down. The 10th day of Tishrei is Yom Kippur. It becomes Yom Kippur eventually. And the day after Yom Kippur, God tells the Jews to build a tabernacle in which to be able to re-experience the spiritual intimacy that they had at Sinai. But he says, stay here. They're still in the Sinai desert. They can still see the mountain, and there's still a cloud of glory on the mountain. So they're still in that catchment area, that spiritual catchment area of Sinai. And he says, so now to build a tabernacle, and you'll dedicate it when I tell you to. And meanwhile, you're staying put. So right now they're still staying put. They haven't moved anywhere. And the 7 days before the month, they built the tabernacle 7 days before the beginning of the month of Nisan, which is the month of Passover. In other words, as they're 3 weeks out of the anniversary of leaving Egypt, and they're still in the Sinai desert, God says, now it's time to inaugurate, to use the word, dedicate. No, let's call it inaugurate the tabernacle, which was a collapsible and movable sanctuary. And Moses does that 7 days. He builds it, he dismantles it. And we went through all of that, and then this takes us up to really through the second book of the Torah and into the third book of the Torah. Where the third book of the Torah, God starts to talk about what's going to go on in the temple and addresses offerings. So we went through the first 2 Torah portions about where the Jews are poised. They're not yet using the tabernacle. Moses has constructed it. It's been inaugurated, if we're going to use that word, and we're ready to launch. So the opening day of using the tabernacle is going to be the first day of Nisan, Rosh Chodesh, we call it Nisan, first day of the month, the Hebrew month, the Jewish month of Nisan, which is 2 weeks before the anniversary, their first anniversary of leaving Egypt. And the way the Torah, and that's the Torah portion we're in, and the way the Torah portion describes it as the 8th day. In other words, we went through 7 days of Moses' inauguration, and then the 8th day, Aaron who's the high priest, and Aaron's sons, who are priests, because they've as priests, and they also go through inauguration ceremony as priests because they're all of the Levite tribe, and God has selected them for this very special public service of being a Kohen. They start to implement the service. Now, what we really didn't talk about is that they started their services of, let's call it, the first one we called inaugurating, this is called dedicating. Started to actually use the tabernacle. And what happened also on that day, this is a big day in Jewish history, that first day of Nisan, as we approach the first anniversary of Passover, is a very big day in our history. It's when the tabernacle, which eventually became the Holy Temple, kicked into action, and a lot of things went on. As a matter of fact, the Talmud says that day has 10 crowns, which we're not going to get into here, but it was a very significant day. And part of it is that Aaron started doing the high priest service. Another thing is that the princes, we'll call them, the leaders of each of the 12 tribes, outside the Levite tribe, the Cohens were public servants, but there were 12 tribes aside from them. And each of those tribes took one day at a time, starting from the tribe of Judah, had their prince come and bring an inaugural or dedicatory offering. And we're not up to that yet in the Torah, but it's all on that day. So this day, it's a very big day. It's a celebration day, as we studied earlier. They were able to see the cloud of glory. It comes off of the mountain, rests on this tabernacle. They know God is with them. No one walks into the tabernacle wondering whether there's a God or whether God cares or whether God is part of their lives. It becomes even more than the air we breathe, because you can't see that. It becomes a very, very tangible and appreciable part of their lives. And it's a beautiful thing for them. Then, what we discussed the last time we met is there's a tragedy in that Aaron, who has 4 sons serving as Cohens, 2 of his sons, who are very, very highly evolved spiritual people, they die. They pass away in the midst of their service. They're in there, they're doing what their thing, and we spoke about the lessons and the insights of the deaths of these 2 very special people, Nadav and Avihu, that we discussed last time. So now we're on page 65, and to the left you see the aftermath of the death of Nadav and Avihu. Nadav and Avihu are Aaron's, as I said, 2 of his 4 sons. They're all wonderful people. Nadav and Avihu are very highly spiritual people, and they're respected through history. They passed away in the middle of the service. And for Aaron's a father, and 2 of his kids just died. Now, before we get into this, the next piece of Torah is very compressed. Torah is, you never get the full story just from looking at the text, but this is a little bit of that on steroids. It's very hard to understand what's going on just from looking at the text itself. You're going to need a lot of, here in this Chumash, in this text, the bolded is a translation of the actual words, and then the unbolded is to make it appreciable. There's going to be a lot of unbolded here, but I want to give you a little bit of background. In Jewish life, when someone passes away, we don't believe that the soul dies, the soul moves on, but there's a tragedy in the fact that the human life, the life of the soul being connected to a body and operating through a body, that has come to an end. And the Torah mandates mourning. Now, mourning is natural, but the Torah gives us a responsibility to, no matter what we're feeling, to be able to show that. And we know that usually as Shiva. There is an idea in an area of Jewish law, which actually in many ways traces from what we're going to read today, even though it's not head on, it is not addressed head on in the text. There's something called an onen. I would transliterate that as O-N-E-I-N, onen. An onen is a person in deep distress or mourning, just from the Hebrew of it. But it means someone on the day a loved one or someone someone within their immediate family has passed on. That means parent, God forbid, parent, spouse, sibling, or child. Those are the people that one is obligated to sit shiva for. And that's someone where there something kicks in called being an onen. So it's not the shiva yet, because shiva begins after the burial. And up until the burial, most of the focus is on the body, on the person who passed away. And we're very careful about it. We treat them like a person, not a carcass. And we're very, very focused on taking care of the deceased. And after burial is only turn to comforting the mourners. But built in to the idea of caring for the deceased, there is the idea of onen. Onen means that a person should not is obligated to turn full focus to the loss, and they're not they're either relieved of doing mitzvahs or not allowed to do mitzvahs really, because, and there are two different reasons for that potentially. The Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud tells us one is that a person just functionally, there's a lot of emphasis put to the idea that you don't get to, when a loved one has passed on, or the truth is this goes, this element, what I'm going to say, goes for someone just where there's no one, if we know someone has passed on and there's no one taking care, let's start from that actually. If a friend, if a neighbor, we find out a neighbor who lives alone and there's no one around caring for them, and we find out they just passed on, we're not allowed to do anything until we've taken care of this person. Now, today's day, that means calling a funeral home. It may mean, calling a cemetery too. But in our world, it may take time and some money, but it's usually the actual work is done by others. Take this back before the modern day, that was a very big deal. But we had every person had an obligation to take care for someone who has passed on and doesn't have people taking care of their final arrangements, as we call them. And that's called a mace mitzvah. A person who was a mitzvah, a mace means passed on, was dead. It's a mitzvah to take care of them. And everything stops. Business, no davening, no shana, whatever it is, you have to take care of this person. Now, I don't, right now, first of all, obviously, it's not common that we have that situation because people have arrangements and there are funeral homes and have kedishas, burial societies and so on. We do know when loved ones passed on. But the way in fundamental Torah law, the idea of knowing someone has passed on and having to take care of that person, the first thing went to family. And therefore, all of the family, parents, spouse, siblings, children, you have to stop what they're doing. And they're not allowed they're not even allowed to do mitzvahs. They're not allowed to put on tefillin. They have to stop. Even if they're going to eat, they don't make a blessing. They stop what they're doing and go and take care of the deceased. Now, a second reason, so that is somewhat where it's from the Talmud, is it's respect for the deceased, but it's also functional. Someone's got to take care of it, and we don't want you distracted. Another thing found from in the Jerusalem Talmud is out of respect for the loss. We want to keep total focus. And therefore, even if, making a bracha of a blessing of hamotzi before a tuna sandwich after a loss, that's not really, it shouldn't impede, burials arrangements, but it's a question of focus. So those two, are seen as primary, as the reasons for this idea of owning. Now, the idea of owning biblically is really what we know from that a Kohen was not allowed to do the service. We'll see it from here. A Kohen was not allowed to do the service if they lost one of their immediate relatives, because of one of the reasons we spoke about. Now, that means, and that what that translates into in Jewish law was not that the Kohen can't do the service. It means anything in interacting, because it wasn't only Kohens who ate from sacred food in the times of the temple. There was different people and different situations. We could all partake something. A person was not allowed to partake of any what we're going to call hallowed or sacred food, tithes, whatever it may be, while an owning. And that's the biblical law. What the rabbis expanded that to was the idea of total cessation of anything that we're involved in. God forbid if a person should be an owning. A person who's an owning also does not eat. They definitely don't eat meat or drink wine, which one is permitted to do during Shiva, but not as an owning. And even the eating is irregular. But there is the idea of not partaking in a full meal. It's focus on the loss on the deceased. So usually that will last a day. Sometimes it takes more than a day to bury someone, but as long as we know that it's in the hands of people who take care of it, you have to speak to a rabbi about how long the owning situation will attach, especially if you hear a loved one. I'm just saying this because of life. I don't want to give any misleading information. You hear a loved one who's in Israel passed away that actually doesn't have the law of owning in that way because you're not there. But there are laws similar to Shiva that would kick in according to the way most of us see it. So most Jewish, most Torah authorities see it. Now back to Nadav and Avihu. Nadav and Avihu passed away. It's opening day in the temple. There are offerings to bring. It's very holy stuff and very exciting stuff. So now, what are they going to do? The primary functionaries here are the deceased father and two brothers. They're all ownings. So now let's take a look at the fourth reading. Bottom of 65 on the left side. Once the bodies of Nadav and Avihu were removed from the tabernacle, the installation ceremonies could resume. So Aaron offered up the additional sacrifices for the first of the month. Okay, so they're telling you this in the unbolded, but an exception to the rule, which I should mention before, an exception to the rule of onen and the services was the high priest. The high priest was, I guess we assume that he had the emotional bandwidth for proper respect for the loss of a loved one, but also the gravity of what they were doing. They continued with the service. So now Aaron offered up the additional sacrifice of the first of the month, because it's also Rosh Chodesh. Once all the sacrifices have been offered up, the question arose as to whether the portions of the sacrifices designated to be eaten by the priest should be eaten by Aaron and his two remaining sons, since they were mourning, because eating it was also part of the service. And now what are they supposed to do? sometimes if there's an offering that's brought and can't be eaten, so it's burned. So what are they supposed to do? As will be recounted later, there's another issue here. Princes of the 12 tribes, and I mentioned this before, donated dedication offerings for the inauguration of the altar. And God told Moses to offer up one of these each day during the first 12 days of the full functioning of the tabernacle, which is what we discussed before. First one to be offered up on the 1st of Nisan, which is today, was that of Nachshon, the son of Aminadab, who was the prince of the tribe of Judah. 12 tribes, 12 days, Judah comes first. These dedication offerings included grain offerings, part of which were also eaten by the priest. So the same question applied to Nachshon's grain offering. So now he's got Aaron, they have these, there were animal offerings that, what do we do with it now? And then there was also Nachshon's grain offering. It's supposed to be eaten by the Kohen. That's them. So Moses spoke as follows to Aaron and his surviving sons, Elazar and Itamar. Those are the two other sons. Even though only a high priest is permitted and required to eat his offerings on the day his close relatives die, all three of you, in this respect too, are subject to the stringency of the high priest. So you must therefore eat the portions of the installation grain offering and the dedication grain offering of Nachshon, son of Aminadab, that are designated to be eaten by the priest. So he comes along and he says, in this case, you two kids, you have to adopt as an outlier, the practice of the high priest, even though you're not high priest, it's your dad who's the high priest, and you will be exempt from this. It's considered a stringency that you have to eat it, and there's no, even though we don't own it, there's no abstaining from it. Thus, take the portion of the grain offerings left over after their memorial portions were burned up as God's fire offerings and eat them as unleavened loaves. We had spoken earlier, probably 6 weeks ago or 7 weeks ago, a portion of the grain offering went for something called memorial portion, and eat them. You must eat these grain offerings near the altar, which means within the tabernacle precincts, for they are sacrifices of superior holiness. So it's very special stuff. It's very high voltage spiritual stuff. You have to eat it within the precincts of the temple, but don't think because you're an onen and you're not a high priest that you shouldn't eat it. Goes further on page 66. You must eat them in a holy place, meaning the tabernacle precincts, because they are sacrifices of superior holiness. And for this same reason, the priest portions are only your portion and your son's portion from God's fire offerings, but not your wives and daughters' portions. I don't know why I say wives and daughters' portions. It means not your families, because they could also have their families involved, who weren't either the young boys, whatever it was. So in other words, it's only yours. Don't bring to your family. Eleazar and Itamar must eat them, even though their brothers died today. For so have I been commanded by God that today is an exception to the rule. So Moses is Moses. Moses comes along and says, even though you already know that that by the book, you're not on a day like today when you lost your brothers, you're an onen, you're not supposed to be eating sacrificial foods, sacred foods. Today is an exception to the rule, and you'll live like that, the high priest, who always, even as an onen, can eat from these special foods. You must also eat your portions of the installation peace offerings. However, you do not do so within the tabernacle precincts. We have spoken about different offerings that they have to bring as part of their installation as Kohens. For being peace offerings, they are sacrifices of lesser holiness. So we did deal with that already. Different types of offerings, and they have different restrictions. Some only in the tabernacle precincts, some within within Jerusalem. Therefore, we must only take care to eat. This is in Jerusalem, but it was in the larger courtyard. Therefore, you must only care to eat the breast used as a wave offering and the thigh used as the raised offering, which are functionally pretty much the same thing, in an undefiled place. Anywhere within the borders of the Israelite camp, then you can eat it. Therefore, you may eat your portions of these sacrifices together with your sons and your daughters, although they have been given only as your portion and your son's portion from the peace offering to the Israelites. Only male priests receive portions. You and your sons may share your portions with the female members of your families. So we said, okay, Moses says, here's the deal. You have some higher sanctity offerings, some lower sanctity offerings. You're going to follow the normal rules. and you're going to eat them. The larger one, the higher one's not going to go to the families, but generally you can follow the regular rules and where they may be eaten. As explained previously with regard to all peace offerings, the priest must bring the thigh used as the raised offering, the breast of the animal used as the wave offering, placed on top of the fats used as fire offerings in order to wave them as a wave offering before God. And it's wave like we do the lulav and esrog, we just did in Sukkot. Front, up, down, right, left, north, south, west, east, and up and down. It will bring to you, it will belong to you and your sons with as an internal entitlement as God has commanded. Okay, so this is what it is. They've got an exception to the rule. But then it gets a little bit more dramatic. Fifth reading. Based on Moses' instructions, Aaron and his sons ate their portions of the sacrifices that were prescribed for that day. They ate the installation grain offering. We said there was right. There were offerings that were bringing I'm a Kohen. Today's the day that I'm being installed as a Kohen. There was an offering to bring. The installation sin offering, the installation peace offerings, and nachshans. Nachshon, in other words, the daily prince dedication offering, which was a sin and a grain offering. There was, however, another offering of superior holiness that they normally would have been required to eat. We just counted all like the special offerings, the installation offerings, whether they're installation, the dedication offerings. These were very special days, which were peculiar to that period of time, that day, and that period of time. But there was another one, the sin offering accompanying the additional scent offerings for the first of the month. Now that is not an exceptional offering. It was brought every month. Every Rosh Chodesh, it was an offering brought. However, unlike the other offerings, this was not an exceptional offering prescribed specifically for that day, but rather a regular offering that was brought to be brought every month. So they were on an exceptional day, dealing with exceptional foods, and Moses says, here's an exception to the rule, and you guys should eat even though you're on it. They do eat those, but then there's on this exceptional day, there's a non-exceptional offering, which is the Rosh Chodesh one. Next month they're going to eat the same thing. What do they do with that as onits? Since Moses, when he informed Aaron and his sons that God had instructed them to eat their portions of the sacrifices, even though they were mourning their close relatives, had only mentioned the 2 grain offerings that were prescribed solely for that day, they assumed that this directive only applied to such sacrifices and not regular sacrifices that were prescribed for all time. So right now it seems they're using logic. They don't have any divine revelation of what to do, but they're saying it's a very special time in history. We're bringing special offerings. They get installed as a Kohen once in their lives. This is installation of the Kohen. It's a very special day. They're dedicating the temple, the tabernacle once. So all of these things are they're all unique offerings. And Moses tells them, and here's a unique law for the unique offerings, even as an onen eat it. In their minds, they say, okay, that's because they're unique offerings. But the regular Rosh Chodesh one, we should treat it like an onen. And Moses had only mentioned the unique ones. The regular rule, they reasoned, still applied to regular sacrifices, meaning they were forbidden to eat the meat of this goat. That's what would have happened the next month. Why should it be different now? And why couldn't they just wait till the next day to eat it? Because waiting until the next day to eat it when they would no longer be in mourning was not an option. Since sacrifices of superior holiness may not be eaten beyond the day they're offered up on the following night. So because there are restrictions and guidelines for offerings, and these offerings had to be eaten that day. That day they're owning. Owning only expires the next day. So they know what to do with it. But to do with it, they couldn't eat it in their minds. Therefore, instead of eating their portion of the sin offering goat brought on the first of the month, they burned it up, as should be done with any sacrifice that cannot be eaten within its prescribed time. They burned it. So Moses, however, assumed the opposite. Since God had told him that neither Aaron nor his sons should observe mourning practices that day so as not to dampen the celebratory mood, he reasoned that this was the motivation behind the directive he heard from God with regard to the 2 grain offerings. Since this concern would preclude observing mourning practices in any fashion, this directive should rightly apply to all the sacrifices offered up by the day, without exception. Moses is saying this wasn't an exception for the offerings. It was an exception to the concept of mourning, because it's a very special day. This is the way he saw it. It's a very special day, the first day of Nisan, where it's opening day of the tabernacle. You're the functionaries. You're everybody's watching you. You are representing the Jewish people. You, no matter what the grief in our hearts, in your hearts, in our hearts, notwithstanding, you have to do the functions. Well, doing the functions means the Rosh Chodesh offering too. So he said it to them explicitly about the unique offerings, but it meant in general. He meant it in general. So now Moses inquired about the sin offering higo for the first of the month when he noticed that Aaron and his sons were not eating it. So now he says, hey, what's going on? I didn't, whatever he would have expected, he saw they weren't eating it. And he discovered that it had been burned up. Wondering if Aaron and his sons had decided that being in mourning precluded them from eating any offerings, page 67 at the top, other than the 2 grain offerings that had been mentioned explicitly, Moses inquired about the other sacrifices and found they had been eaten. So he says, 1 second, I told you something. What, did you eat the grain offerings too? No. We did the right thing. We ate. So he became angry. And this is, one of those times we find that it doesn't say clearly that it became angry, but the language is he's angry. So he became angry, even though it doesn't say it clearly, but they put it in bold because it's so obvious. Okay. Oh no, actually on the other one it says, on the other page, the language like tough. Okay, so he became angry with Aaron for a seemingly careless attitude towards God's instructions, but out of respect for Aaron, he instead accosted Eleazar and Tamar, Aaron's surviving sons, demanding a response to his question. So he's upset. See, you guys didn't follow the rules. He doesn't want to go after his older brother, though if he will. He speaks to the kids. Why don't you do that? Why don't you? I gave you some clear instructions. Why did you not eat the sin offering for the first of the month? Was it perhaps at any time not in the holy place, the tabernacle precincts, thereby being rendered fit for consumption? He doesn't jump to a conclusion, although he got angry. He said, "What's going on?" There are other factors that would have come in where you would not have been able to eat it, like if it had been taken out of its proper holy place, in which case you couldn't eat it, and the only thing you could do with it is burn it. Did something mess up in the system that you took it out of the tabernacle precincts? The answer, no, it was not. So if so, Moses continued, why did you not eat it as required? God has given it to you in order to thereby gain forgiveness for the sin of the community. In case anyone unknowingly entered their tabernacle or ate sacrifices while either they or the sacrifices were in a state of defilement to effect their atonement before God. You're supposed to do this as an atonement for the people. Why didn't you eat it? The atonement to the community is dependent upon your eating the sacrifices. So even if you wish to be more stringent than was required of you by refraining from eating them because of your state of mourning, you had no right to be. You can't be frum on someone else's account. This is something, and this gives us insight also into why they were allowed in this case to function and with the offerings, because the Cohens, there was a very small circle of Cohens at this point. Eventually, you'd have some Cohens are going to be in owning, but then there's other Cohens to do the service. But here, you have to do the service, and it's not about you. It's not your personal thing. This is a communal offering. It's to the benefit of the community. You have no right to let that lapse or go by the wayside because of your personal state of mourning, as difficult as that is. Verse 18, behold, its blood was not brought into the sanctuary, which would have also have necessitated burning it. So you would have surely eaten it within holy precincts, even though your brothers died today. You should have surely eaten it within holy precincts, even though your brothers died today, as I commanded you with regard to the grain offering. which, like the sin offering, is a sacrifice of superior holiness, and which therefore can be taken as a precedent for the sin offering. You're supposed to act like high priest today. You're supposed to eat, and nothing went wrong with it, so for you to burn it, why didn't you do what I told you? Moses then continued to interrogate them. Did you apply the blood to the altar yourselves, which have also invalidated the sacrifice, since a mourner who performs any sacrificial rite thereby invalidates the sacrifice, nor therefore been required to burn the sacrifice, because you were supposed to eat it. You weren't supposed to do everything. So maybe you did something else. Give me something to explain to me why you didn't listen to me and why you burned the sacrifice instead of eating it. Although Elazar and Isamar could have responded conclusively to Moses, they felt it would not be respectful to Aaron, their father, because he's standing right there to speak in his presence, in order to be respectful to contradict Moses, their teacher and their uncle. So they remained silent and waited for Aaron to respond. Seeing this, Aaron said harshly, it doesn't say harshly anything, but he said, let's go, harshly is a harsh word. I would go for, he said definitively or forcefully to Moses, did they offer up their sin offering or their scent offering today before God? Did they? It was I who sacrificed his offering. And this is permitted, for I am the high priest who, as you have taught us, is permitted to perform sacrificial rites even on the day his close relative dies. So the sin offering goat was not burned up because it had become invalid. It was burned up because you have no justification for applying the leniency you heard from God regarding eating the special sacrifices prescribed for today, the sacrifice that will also be offered up on a regular basis from now on. Aaron says, we did the right thing. But now you're coming along and saying we're supposed to somehow transfer that directive that God gave you and you gave us about not applying onin protocol to offerings and to holy matters. You told us to do it about the installation offerings, the unique offerings for today. Now, somehow you're saying that also applies to the more normative Rosh Chodesh offering. Based on what? Where'd you get that from? You argue that God does not want us to dampen the mood by observing the laws of mourning. Perhaps this is true only with regard to the sacrificial rites themselves, which take place next to the altar, the focus of the celebration. And I did indeed offer up all the sacrifices there, including the sin offering for the first month as required. Let's go to 68, and we'll come back to 67 later for the Chassidic insights. But since eating the sacrifices need not take place next to the altar, just somewhere within the tabernacle precincts, observing the laws of mourning with regard to eating the sacrifices cannot be construed as dampening the celebratory mood of the day. Therefore, the fact that God only explicitly allowed us to eat today's special offerings implies that this leniency applies only to them because they are an intrinsic part of today's installation ceremonies. If so, this leniency cannot be applied to the sacrifices that will be offered up on a regular basis from now on. So Aaron is challenging the thinking of Moses, which is quite a big deal, but it was because he has to explain why he did it. Therefore, inasmuch as tragic events like these befell me and I'm in mourning, if I had eaten the regular sin offering today, would it have pleased God? He himself has told us that mourners may not eat sacrificial meat. So why are you telling me this? I know my son's passed away. I know I'm in mourning, but I I know that God that gave us rules of what we could do and not do. But and there was an exception to the rule for the dedication offerings, the inaugural offerings. But then there's the way we deal with the irregular offerings. Would God have been happy if I took the exception and applied it to everything else? 20, it says, Moses heard and understood this explanation and accepted it. It pleased him so much that he was not embarrassed to admit that Aaron's argument was superior to his. Let it be known that he had accepted Aaron's conclusion, even though he only heard it from him and not from God. In his anger, what was obvious to Aaron eluded him. So there are a few things here that the Talmud picks up on here we find, first of all, we find this case, but Moses was Moses, and Moses is, there's only one Moses. But the point where the Torah finds where we can look to learn from what not only from Moses falling short, if we can call it that, was when it came to anger. Not anger because someone stepped on his toe, but anger, a righteous indignation where he's standing up for God. There are a couple of times like that, and 3 times you can think of it in the Torah. And this is something where the idea of anger is anger to I guess to a psychologist. Anger is natural, and I guess it's how it's responded to. But anger that is not only felt, but unhealthily experienced and expressed is something that the Talmud is very, very strongly against. And it's something that it's a human struggle. Different people struggle differently, different temperaments. But the fact is, everybody has the sensation of anger. And again, anger itself it's a natural sensation. It's not a treifa sensation. But the question is, do we choose to develop it, to marinate in it, to maybe stifle it and act in passive aggressive ways? Throw a plate at the wall. Well, there are different ways of doing it. Some of them are very unhealthy, and they're unhealthy for the person and unhealthy for relationships. So anger is seen as a real poison if it's not healthily channeled. And in Moses' case, we look at it and say the idea of him being upset, or what we would call riled up, something wasn't done right. It's acceptable. It's natural. The expression of it is seen as that it got carried away. He got carried away with it. That even you can see from language of the Talmud, which are similar to some of the way we use it in English. Also, sometimes we lose ourselves. So if we lose ourselves, who finds us? Who's in control? So a guided sense of passionate indignation that we can identify with ourselves as anger, that can be a good thing. But the idea of losing it is never a good thing. And one of the things we find by Moses is that caused not only in this case, caused a derailment of his proper focus on God and God's will, and caused him to either to forget or to not reason the way he should have. Aaron's calculation should not have eluded Moses. So there's one of the lessons here of anger. And as far as Moses goes, on the flip side, Moses, as great as he was, the Torah tells us later that he was the most humble person on the face of the earth, which is saying something, because he wasn't denying his great attributes and his great achievements, but he was being down to earth about them and not taking them as and recognizing what God had given him, his gifts, and not taking credit for his gifts, just for what he did with the gifts. So one of the things that Moses says here is, even when, first of all, he's able to admit when he's wrong, but here also he admits that I didn't tell me anything. God didn't tell me anything. So, which means the idea of that I'm not in control of all truth. Alternatively, Aaron and his sons burned up the sin offering of the first of the month because it had become defiled through contact with some defiled creature. This is another opinion, and since, and Rashi brings it also, since it could no longer be eaten, they burned it up immediately. When Moses heard that this was the case, he agreed with what they did. There was no argument over the proper course of action. So that there's other lane that Rashi takes would I've saved this 2 pages of narrative, but the primary way of looking at the narrative is more about the idea of the debate over what was the rational way to go forward. So let's turn back to 67 and look at the Hasidic insights. Moses discovered that it had been burned up, right? And not eaten. So, and that's when he became angry with Aaron. Moses and Aaron's perspectives on the difference between the special sacrifices of the day and those that would be offered up on a regular basis reflect their emphases in our relationship with God. They had different attitudes to life. Moses was looking at things from the inside out. This is God's law, and it has to be applied and respected. Aaron believed very much in the law, was very connected to God, but he was, and this has come up at different times in our conversations, I'm sure. Aaron was a leader of the people. Aaron, conceptually say, Aaron knew, how much a quart of milk cost. He understood the struggles of the people. He was engaged in people's lives. He was known for making peace between quarreling family members or partners. He was with the people in their tzaras, in their struggles, and helped them. And Moses was more representative of God, but not as much in the trenches with the people. So if you look at it here, as we saw above, Moses was devoted to transmitting God's Torah to the people. He was a Torah guy. That was what God wanted from him. He brought it to the people. But he was looking at the world that way, like from the inside out, from God and Torah to the people. Whereas Aaron was devoted to elevating the people to the Torah. Aaron was busy trying to get people into a position so that they can be emotionally available and open to practicing the Torah and living properly. If we imagine the relationship between God and the Jewish people as a marriage, and this did come up in one of our classes, if I remember correctly, and we're going to the chuppah. When we go to the chuppah, the groom and the bride each have escorts. So Moses, the Zohar, Kabbalah tells us that Moses had the place of the one who escorted the heavenly groom to the canopy. If we got married to the Jewish people got married to God at Sinai, so then that was the chuppah. Moses was ushering God to the chuppah, and Aaron, the one who escorted the earthly bride, us. So what does it mean here? Torah is objective and unchanging truth, whereas humans are subjective and constantly changing. So Moses saw the Torah's truth as being uniformly applicable to all situations, in all situations. He says, this is what the Torah says, this is the law, it is what it is. Aaron was more sensitive to nuances on the user end. In contradistinction to Aaron, who realized that each situation must be assessed individually in order to know how to apply the Torah's immutable truth effectively. Aaron saw that an ad hoc sacrifice is different than one that would be offered up regularly. And God's truth can be reflected differently on different levels. He said you're talking about, it's a day of joy for people, it's a day of joy for the Jewish people. I'm telling you that in the experience, it's not exactly the same thing. That this is the dedication offerings, the unique offerings, the inauguration offerings is one thing, and they can understand we don't want to diminish the joy by even as an onen not eating it, and therefore we have to eat it, and that makes sense. But the idea that somehow not eating of the Rosh Chodesh offering, which everyone knows is going to be a perpetual one for every month, that's not going to chip away at that. And the fact is that we're onens, and we have a standing instruction not to eat this as onens. In our own lives, we must evince both Moses and Aaron's perspectives. Moses and Aaron are both great leaders of ours. So we each have a Moses within us and an Aaron within us. For ourselves, we must be like Moses, devoted to the Torah's truth, absolutely and unchangingly. Moses, he didn't know any chachmas. Torah, and here's a rule, we apply it. And we have to feel the same way. When interacting with others, we, like Aaron, must take into account their moods and inclinations, drawing them closer to the Torah through forgiving love. So, I was just having a conversation with some of the Chabad rabbis in New Jersey yesterday. There's our standards that we aspire to, and we have to be conscious of, and we have to try to implement. Some things are inviolable, but sometimes on the user end, there's room to try and make something a little more user-friendly for someone in a community, because that's also part of Torah. Again, doesn't mean I give someone a cheeseburger, but there are things where we would go where there's room to be able to make to sometimes make something a little bit more accessible, even if it's not the ideal. Our ideal, if we're working with people and we want to be careful about them and want to make sure that they're feeling welcome, we want to be able to open that up, that possibility to so that people can experience Torah for themselves, to also at their level. So, is there any questions? Let me find. Otherwise, I think we would leave it here, because at the bottom of 68 we start a whole new section of the Torah, which is the kosher animals. And go through there's twice in the Torah we have the idea of kosher animals being addressed in kosher species, and we're up to that here. So
Thank you.
be well. A great week and a wonderful year ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.